Hey guys, I'm Brittany from Quarter Acre Roots, where we talk about growing a lot on a little bit of space, and today we are talking about seed starting. I'm going to be doing some seed starting chores here in Maryland Zone 7A and talking through 10 of the mistakes that beginner and sometimes experienced gardeners alike make when starting their seeds indoors. I will be including chapters down in the description of this video, so if you want to jump around the video or skip certain parts, just use the little navigation links down in the description and let's get started. So the first mistake is starting seeds too early or too late. Now this might sound obvious, but it can get very overwhelming every year remembering when to start things. Life can just catch up with you and you'll forget to start things, or you have the opposite problem and you start things too early and then you have these plant starts that you can't put outside yet that you're stuck like keeping happy indoors. You want to shoot for the sweet spot right in the middle of those two things. So again, I'm in Maryland Zone 7A. So when you're watching this, we just had our 8 weeks until our last frost date. A couple days ago on Sunday was 8 weeks until our last frost date. So today I'm going to be starting some tomatoes. Now on the back of the package, it says to start them indoors 4 to 6 weeks before your last frost date. However, I add like 2 weeks onto that. So I start between 6 to 8 weeks instead of 4 to 6 weeks, because I do have a small greenhouse in my backyard that I will move my seed starts into 2 weeks earlier just to get a little bit more of a jump start. I do recommend, even if you don't have an outdoor greenhouse, when you're looking at that seed window, I always go on the later end because you just don't know what problems you might encounter when you're starting your seeds. So if something says 2 to 4 weeks, I go with 4 weeks. If something says 4 to 6 weeks, I go with 6 weeks, and vice versa. One of my favorite free tools that I recommend to everyone and that I personally use every single year is the Old Farmer's Almanac planting calendar. So this is super easy. It's just a website that you can bookmark. You put your zip code in and then it gives you a nifty table of all of the most common and even some like less common crops that you could be growing. It tells you when to start seeds indoors, when to transplant them outdoors, and when to direct sow your seeds, because some things are better direct sown in the garden compared to like starting seeds indoors. I keep a gardening notebook. I write down dates where I start things. I write down dates where I like pot things up, transplant things, but I use the Old Farmer's Almanac planting calendar every single year because I want to make sure that I'm keeping up to date with what the best practices are. And also, like, it's impossible to remember everything. It's just a really good reminder for when you should be planting certain things, especially if you don't keep your own records of what you're planting. The second mistake that people make is overcrowding containers. So I like using these types of seed starting cells. They're super deep. You can easily like keep them in a tray and water them. You can monitor the root growth and root development on the slits on the sides, and then also the drainage holes on the bottom. What I do when I'm starting seeds, unless it's like a super expensive seed that I definitely don't want to go to waste and that I know will last for many years, so I want to keep it for planting next year and the year after, I will seed too many seeds in each cell. I also do that when I save my own seeds because I'm never like totally sure if I've saved the seeds properly. Like, this is not a sterile seed saving operation in my house. I do save a lot of seeds, but I don't like test their germination or anything. So when I save my own seeds, I usually overseed in each cell and then thin them out. You can see here, I've definitely not taken my own advice when it comes to overseeding in the different cells. These seeds are all from a Carolina Reaper pepper that a friend of mine gave me last year, and I saved all of the seeds from that pepper to plant this year. I wasn't sure how many of them would germinate, so I seeded every single seed that I had in here, and one of these cells has 5 plants in it. So that's definitely way too many plants. Now, what a lot of people will do is just thin these out, so they'll just pluck out the ones they don't want to keep and chuck them, but like many gardeners, I have a really hard time thinning out and throwing away plants, especially when it's something like this that I know a lot of people might want to grow, either because they love super spicy food and a Carolina Reaper seed is a little bit harder to come by, or just because they want to try something new. So I will be popping all of these out and separating them and potting them up separately, probably in another week or so that these will not be competing for so little space in each of these cells. The third mistake that people make is using a seed starting medium that is too dense or heavy. So you do not want to use a garden soil or something that's not like super well draining. I occasionally will start my seeds using a like super lightweight potting mix, But the best way to start your seeds is using something like a coconut coir here. You can buy pre-made seed starting mixes, and a lot of times what it is just peat moss. I personally do not use peat moss because it is not a super environmentally friendly medium to use, but I use coconut coirs. So I buy these bricks. They look like this when I buy them. They come compressed, and then I put them in a bucket and add water until they're fully expanded. So this brick right here is completely like packed, compressed, and dehydrated. So it will expand to like fill this entire tub. It's a very economical way to start your seeds. And then once I have expanded all of it, I will pack it into my seed starting trays here. All of these are empty. I'm going to be seeding these today. And then I press it down with my fingers and then add a little bit more in, and then I flush it out. So I will set them in the sink and just run water down through them to flush out like any extra salts. Every time I say that I use coco coir for my seed starting, I get comments from people saying that it's too salty, it will clog my plant's stomata, it will lead to unhealthy seedlings, all these things. If you don't want to use coconut coir, that's fine with me. I like using it, and again, my seedlings are super duper happy. If you are using it for the first time and you're finding that your seedlings aren't happy and you've ruled out all of your other variables, you may want to add something like this to help balance the levels in your coconut coir. This is completely optional. I do not use this. I just make sure to flush out the coconut coir, and then when I start fertilizing my plants, after the seeds have a couple sets of true leaves, I will bottom water, but I will occasionally water them in the sink to flush out that medium again. And I do this with all of my plants, even my house plants. I will run water through the top and not bottom water because I want to flush out that soil. So that's generally gonna be a best practice anyway. It is also super easy to take your seed starts out of their containers when they're ready to be potted up, and then it just kind of crumbles away from the roots that have grown. So definitely my favorite thing to use to start seeds. There are lots of different methods and approaches out there, but just make sure you're not using a heavy soil or garden soil or raised bed soil or something like that. The fifth mistake I want to cover is overwatering or underwatering your seedlings. So you can see here, I have all of these 4-cell seedling thingies, and they're sitting on this tray. So these came together. This is a Vego Garden seed starting set. And I love these because it's the jumbo set, so they're super duper deep. It gives the plants lots of room to grow, but it also makes watering really easy. So as I mentioned, I like to fill these up and then flush them out, like generally every, I don't know, maybe like couple weeks. But when I'm not top watering to flush out the soil, I love the ease of bottom watering these. Now, bottom watering has a lot of great benefits. So I'll just come in here and I'll fill up this tray, and then I'll leave it. And when I come back a few minutes later, it's completely sucked up into these seed cells. And what that allows us to do is bring the water into the bottom of these seed cells to encourage the roots to grow down. So you don't want the roots to be staying super shallow and circling. You want them to be growing down and filling up this whole seed starting area. Bottom watering can also help to prevent overwatering because the soil will soak up what it needs at that point to be happy. And a lot of these I have sitting on heat mats. So if there's excess water that is sitting in the tray after I water the plants, after I bottom water them, it will generally evaporate because of the heat coming up from the heat mat underneath. So that makes overwatering really, really challenging. I come in and water my seedlings every couple of days, depending on what stage they're at. Seedlings need a lot of light and water. So I'm usually watering every 2 to 3 days, depending on the plant and depending on if I have a heat mat on it or not. To show you guys what can happen with too much watering from the top, I have pulled up another one of my favorite seed starting sets. This is the green stalk seed starting set in blackberry, so a really lovely color. And this one is also great for watering because each of these containers have the air pruning slits on the sides and then also areas on the bottom for the plant to soak up that water. I will just fill this tray with water, and then I will lift this up and dump out the excess water here. Now, at first, I was top watering these. I don't even know why I was top watering these. I was just top watering them. If you keep your seedlings too moist for too long, I'll show you exactly what can happen. So you can start getting that green growth. You can see this here. Now, that's not always going to be something that hurts your plants. I'm not too worried about that harming these onion seedlings. These onion seedlings will go out sooner than some of my other transplants because they are a little bit hardier with the cold. So I'm not as worried about that. But what I'm going to do is just come in here and encourage some aeration and basically some airflow to get down a little further in these seed cells. I'm just taking a toothpick and coming in and kind of fluffing up the soil a little bit just to get a little bit more air in there. Now this problem will probably take care of itself, or quite frankly, it just will hang around until I get these outside. But if your seedlings are a little bit more sensitive to overwatering, or if they are much younger, what can end up happening is, especially if you start your seedlings in something that is not a sterile medium, like you can see, I use a well-draining potting soil for these. If you start them in something that's not a sterile medium, then you can end up with what is referred to as damping off. And that is a fungal issue that infects your seedlings and kills them, mostly when they're still pretty young. Now, as they get a little bit older and they get stronger, it becomes much less of an issue, which is why I'm not super worried about these onion starts here. I really think they're gonna be fine. But again, if you use something that's not a sterile medium and you're watering only from the top, you may end up with some fungal growth or some of this green algae growth, or just stuff that you don't want, like fungus gnat infestations in your seedlings, because fungus gnats like to lay their eggs in the top few inches of soil and they like it to be damp. So that's why a lot of people get fungus gnats with their houseplants when they're overwatering them, because they're watering them from the top. And then fungus gnats are finding that delicious wet soil in the top few inches. They're laying their eggs and they're reproducing like crazy. So the best way to get rid of your fungus gnats with your houseplants is also to back off your watering and make sure that you're not watering too often, that you are waiting generally for a lot of houseplants until like the top half of the soil dries out. And this is also the solution I take for overwatered houseplants. I just use a fork or something and aerate the top few inches of the soil and then let it dry out to try and kill everything off before I water it again. I want to jump right into the sixth mistake people make, because this is a good example of that mistake. I'm making it myself. I'm not too worried about it though with these onions, because again, they're pretty hardy. But people will avoid potting up and then things get too crowded. So I do have a couple onion starts in each of these. And as you can see, I'm getting great root growth coming down, but these roots down here, I don't want to clip these because I don't want to shock the plant. Instead, I'm going to move these onion starts to an area that gets a little bit less light and is a little bit cooler. So the goal there is to just kind of slow down their growth a little bit, since I am going to be hardening these off and putting them outside in a couple of weeks. Onions have very sensitive roots, so some of these that have multiple onion starts in them, I don't want to take these out and pot them up separately. I just want to let these ride until I can put them all in the ground or in a raised bed. But if this were something like tomatoes, you do want to be planting in something that has air pruning strips and then monitoring those roots on the bottom to see how much they're growing. If you are getting to the point of where they're growing a lot out of the container, or you find that they're starting to circle the container, don't avoid potting them up. You want to pot them up for most of the things that you're going to be starting indoors. I mentioned my Carolina Reaper peppers. These have not shown any signs of roots on the sides or the bottom. So I'm going to be giving these a couple more days before I unpot them and start to pot them up separately, because I'm not afraid of them competing for space in here, even though there are like 4 little plants in one of these cells, 5 little plants, because they're not showing me any root growth, which means that they do not have super big root systems yet. So there are rules, there are guidelines, and then there are your actual plants that you need to be watching and monitoring and remembering these best practices so you can make a determination about what the best way forward is for your current seedlings and their conditions. The sixth thing I want to cover is light. Having insufficient light for your seedlings. And this is a big one. I mentioned that seedlings, when they're getting started, need a lot of light and a lot of water to be happy. I am standing right now in front of the sunniest part of my home. So sunny, in fact, fact that I have to have a sheer curtain up here, even in the winter, because it can get so hot here and have such direct sun that the leaves on these plants that I have hanging here can burn and scorch and just get discolored because of all of the sun. Even this window would probably not be enough light for seedlings to thrive. Sure, I could start them here and they would probably be fine, but they wouldn't be super healthy and they would probably get very leggy, leaning toward the sun where the light source is on this side. So they will be getting very uneven light. If this is the only way you have to start seeds, I would definitely recommend coming in and rotating your seedlings every couple days and monitoring them to make sure that the leggy growth isn't too bad. Leggy growth is what you get when a plant is reaching for the light. So I'll show you an example of that in one of my seed starting cabinets here in just a second. When you look at these pepper seedlings here, they probably look pretty healthy, but as I turn them, you can see that they are leaning now away from me. And this is because I had them in another spot where the light distribution was not super even. So to fix that, I put them here into this area where I've got reflectors all the way around. It helps to more evenly distribute the light. So every couple days, I'll come in here and rotate the plant so that the seedlings start to grow a little bit more even. And I'm not getting that legginess that I had before. This is something that will generally even itself out as plants begin to grow and after you transplant them outdoors or pot them up, especially if it's something like tomatoes where you can bury leggy stems a little bit deeper so that they root and aren't as leggy. But definitely keep in mind how much light seedlings need to thrive. Also remember that seedlings are going to need a lot more light than plants are going to need. So for example, I have my grow lights here very close to my seedlings. If you're just getting started, it may feel like they're too close to your seedlings. But this is exactly the distance that is optimal for these seedlings that I have right now. It gives me full coverage of all of these, and as they get bigger, I can move this tray down so that they are farther away from the light and have more even coverage, because as the plants get taller, those bigger leaves that they start sprouting will be able to soak in more and more of the light, and of course they need more vertical room to grow, so you can move them away from the light. But you want the light to be very close to the seeds when they're getting started. Also, a note on using grow lights or shop lights. I have a video comparing using grow lights and shop lights for starting seedlings. Grow lights can tend to be a little bit more expensive. They're going to be your full spectrum of light that seedlings need, whereas shop lights are much, much cheaper, and they're not designed specifically for seed starting. They're designed for places like shops and basements. We have them behind me on a rack that you can see in the background. I have some shop lights hanging up because that's where I originally had my onion seedlings starting. So shop lights are a great alternative if you're just getting started. They put out a lot of super bright light. Just keep in mind that they do get a little hotter than some of the full spectrum grow lights out there can get, because they're generally not going to be an LED type of light that emits less heat. So you don't want them to burn your plants, and they are not going to provide the full spectrum of light that your plants need after they get like probably 1 to 2 sets of true leaves. Then I would either move your seedlings outdoors or to an area with full spectrum grow lights. If you don't have a dedicated seed starting space, or you're only starting like, what is this? 4 times 8. I'm horrible at math. Is that 32? Hopefully it's 32. You can get something like this. So Vego Garden sent me this. It is awesome. And it basically turns this into a little greenhouse. So this fits right over all of these jumbo seedling trays in this smaller, or the larger tray on the bottom. And then it has a spot in the top for a full spectrum grow light. So what you can do is put this anywhere in your house. Put that grow light on top, plug it in, make sure it's on, and then it will light up everything underneath of it. So this is a really awesome solution for a smaller space area. I'm going to fill up my seedling shelves, and then on the bottom of my Vego 4-tier planting shelving, I made a video about that previously and said that one of the things I did not like about it was that it felt like the bottom shelf was kind of a waste of space because the plants were way too far away from the grow light. I'm gonna put this guy on the bottom shelf because it's got its own grow light here, and hopefully when the seedlings are larger, I can put them on that bottom shelf without the grow light right on top of it, because again, they can be a little bit farther away from the grow light once they get a couple sets of their true leaves. Okay, this next one is something that I've already touched on a little bit throughout the other sections because it's kind of related to some of the other things that I've covered, but that is failing to pot up or thin out your seedlings. As I mentioned, I hate thinning out and throwing away my seedlings. It's just like a common thing for people who grow things from seed. You don't want to just pluck them out and throw them away. Now, this is much easier for things like lettuce. When I'm sowing like a direct row of lettuce outside, it's much easier for me to justify thinning out those extra lettuce seedlings and, you know, just chucking them. But for things that I've like slaved over starting indoors, like these tomato seedlings that I'm planting right now, I do not like plucking them and throwing them away. So instead, what I will do is carefully take them out, separate them at the root level, and pot them up separately in their own pots. But when should you do this? Do this when the plant has a couple sets of true leaves, so the leaves beyond those cotyledon leaves, those first few leaves. When it has a couple sets of true leaves, you can usually safely pot them up separately using a fresh, well-draining soil with nutrients in it. Or pot them up when you notice lots of roots growing out of your seedling cells. So if I have a couple sets of leaves on here, but I'm not seeing any roots growing out, I'm probably just gonna leave multiple plants in each of these cells until one, they're showing signs of stress and I know that they need more room or they need more nutrients, or two, I start seeing those roots and then I pop them out and pot them up separately. The one thing you definitely want to avoid is having your seedlings compete for space and nutrients, because then they'll both suffer and you will have wished that you may have just plucked one of those out and chucked them so that you could have one plant instead of zero. Number 8 is transplanting too early or too late. So we're talking about either transplanting to larger pots or putting them outside. This is an example of a plant that it will be way too early to transplant. This is my ghost peppers, and as you can see, they just have their first set of cotyledons. So they don't even have any true leaves yet. I will definitely not be coming in and potting these up because they are nowhere near ready. However, my eggplants, on the other hand, are showing that they are working on their second set, on some of these, set of true leaves. So these I'm going to be keeping a really close eye on, seeing that root growth and how the plants are doing to determine if I should be potting them up. Now, in terms of when to transplant outdoors, that is wholly dependent on the plant, your growing conditions, and where you're growing. I mentioned the Old Farmer's Almanac planting calendar earlier, and I would say to use that as your general guide. I have a small greenhouse, so I will transition some of my stuff out to my small greenhouse about 2 weeks earlier than I would put them outside if I didn't have a small greenhouse. I also grow under cover a lot, so I have some plastic covers on some of my beds, which will buy me a couple extra weeks on the early and tail ends of the growing season so that I can put things out a little bit earlier. What you want to avoid is working super hard on all of your starts and then putting them out and then getting a late spring frost that kills everything off. Now, if you're watching your weather forecast and you think you're good to put your things out a little bit early and then you get a frost warning on your phone, you can always go out and cover something with something as simple as like a tomato cage or a trash can or a bucket. Anything to protect the frost from touching the foliage on that plant will save it. But it's always best to just, I know it's super duper hard, I know it's hard, you want to put things out, but if you're not growing under plastic sheeting, I would recommend waiting until that last frost date for all of your frost sensitive plants that you've worked so hard on. Plus, you're not really going to get a huge benefit putting things out like a week or two early if you're not covering them and generating more heat using a greenhouse effect that way. They're just gonna kind of like peter along and look really sad because it's just a little bit too cold for them anyway, even if it doesn't frost. So it's always best to wait until the best time to put your plants out, which again is going to depend on where you live and what the plant is. Use the Old Farmer's Almanac planting calendar. It is one of my favorites. For our 9th mistake, we are going to talk about fertilizing. So either over fertilizing or under fertilizing. When a seed sprouts and it has those 2 little first leaves that sprout from the seed, the cotyledons, those cotyledons have everything that the plant needs to get started. They have all of the nutrients it needs, which is why you can start your seeds in a sterile medium like a coco coir or a peat moss. Now, once the plant gets 1 to 2 sets of true leaves, the plant will start to need more nutrients to stay happy. I like to use Fox Farm Grow Big fertilizer because I use the same thing for pretty much everything, including my houseplants when I remember to fertilize them. Anything that's like a balanced organic fertilizer is a good idea. It is harder to over fertilize things when you're using something that's not like a chemical fertilizer like Miracle-Gro, and you can very easily run the risk of burning your plant's roots. Now, a fertilizer like Fox Farm Grow Big is going to be a little bit more expensive, but keep in mind that they're highly concentrated, so when you buy a container of it, it's gonna last you a long time. And I use the same fertilizer for my garden in the summer. I will alternate that with I think it's Blue Planet Nutrients is the brand, liquid kelp seaweed fertilizer, which does amazing things for my plants. I don't use that one as much on my plant starts. I use that one mostly when things are established in the garden because it has like a little bit of a smell to it that I don't love. But I read a review one year that said, if you want if you want 12 feet tomato plants, buy this fertilizer. I did impulsively, and it's amazing. And I would say fertilize them obviously based on whatever fertilizer you're using, what the instructions say, but I generally fertilize like once every maybe 3 to 4 weeks, but there should be seedling instructions or plant start instructions on the back of whatever you're using, so you can make sure not to over or under fertilize and give them exactly what they need to get that healthy, strong start. The last mistake gardeners make is not properly hardening off their seedlings. So when your seedlings are growing indoors, they're like in an ideal environment. They have ideal light, ideal water, ideal temperature and conditions. You are taking them from that like super TLC heavy environment and putting them out into the elements. So they'll have much stronger sun, they'll have wind, they'll have rain, they'll have everything that you could possibly imagine being outside. So you don't want to shock them by just putting them immediately outside from that nice environment. You need to slowly acclimate them, and that's the process of hardening off. I like to start hardening off my seedlings about 2 weeks before I put them outside. So what I will do is I will carry them outside, usually in the morning, just like a whole tray, and set them in a spot that gets some morning sun. So the morning sun is going to be a lot more gentle than that peak sun midday or sun later on in the afternoon. So this will help them work their way up. The first day I might do like an hour in direct morning sun and then put them in a shady spot and then work my way up over the next few days until they can sit outside all day and be totally fine. Since I pot things up out of these trays, I will still use these same trays to just help me carry things in and out, but I also like to use storage tubs to do that. And then I got a bunch of these cheap boot trays from Ikea a couple years ago, and I use them all the time. They kind of help when I'm potting things up to contain the soil in this area if I'm working inside. I also use them in the greenhouse. I use them to carry things around. I use them to bottom water, all sorts of things. They have a bigger size too that's the same width but is longer. That one's great for moving more plants at once, but I highly recommend getting something like this to make the process a little bit easier. And that about wraps up the 10 mistakes that people can make when they are starting seeds. These are mistakes that I continue to make every year because it's impossible to remember everything. It's impossible to do everything perfectly, but a lot of things tend to be very forgiving. So keep these in mind when you are starting your seedlings, and let me know if you guys have any questions. In the meantime, I'm going to continue planting some of my tomato seeds. Until my next video, happy planting.